The Old West was a vast, unexplored territory where the vastness seemed to swallow everything around it. Distances were enormous and communication slow, almost non-existent. Towns were isolated, and those who ventured beyond the borders faced the unknown and solitude. Every journey meant days or even weeks of travel under the scorching sun or the biting cold. The expanse of the desert and mountains seemed endless, and those trying to cross these places, such as traders, travelers, or even explorers, faced unimaginable hardships. That perception of distance was completely altered. A journey that could be made in a few hours anywhere else was, here, a true odyssey. While towns tried to grow, the isolation of the communities was one of the greatest obstacles. What seemed like a simple idea, such as sending a package, would take weeks or even months to reach its destination. Trade was a hard task. Valuable goods remained stagnant, which made it difficult to create markets or expand industries. Trades were limited to those who were physically close, which hampered the growth of the regions and kept the economy confined and dependent on luck and direct contact. The West seemed eternally stuck in the past, with few signs of the future. A woman sitting by a window in an isolated house, looking at the horizon. The sky seems endless, but she knows that the journey to reach the nearest town would take more than a week. With slow trade, life in the countryside, even in its beauty, became a prison. The hope of a better future seemed distant when the only means of communication was mail, which arrived with a delay of weeks. The emotional isolation was as real as the land that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was impossible to thrive without a closer connection, without the ability to expand trade and community life. However, something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The future was about to arrive in a sweeping way, and while no one knew exactly how it would unfold, everyone was about to find out. The railroad, the great invention that would cross the continent, had the power to transform this cruel and unyielding reality. But how would it do that? What changes would it bring to the lives of everyone who depended on this slowness and isolation? The arrival of the railroad, while awakening expectations, also brought doubts and uncertainties. But one thing was certain: nothing in the Old West would ever be the same. At first, the railroad was nothing more than a distant dream, almost impossible to achieve. Many believed that linking the east and west coasts of the United States through iron tracks was unthinkable. But there was a vision for the future that attracted the boldest and most visionary. For those who believed in progress, the railroad was more than just a train line. It was the key to transforming the vastness of the West into a connected, prosperous land full of possibilities. And while the distance was immense, the promise of transformation seemed irresistible. There was no more time to wait. Investors, politicians, and engineers came together to make this vision a reality. The federal government, aware of the strategic importance of the railroad, offered enormous incentives, including vast stretches of land to the railroad companies. It was the type of project that could unite an entire country and ensure that the West, with all its potential, would not remain on the margins of the rest of the nation. But the challenge was colossal. Building a railroad in the desert, crossing mountains and facing the whims of nature seemed an impossible task. Yet the idea of a unified nation and a more prosperous future fueled the courage of those who would face any obstacle. As the two major railroad companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, competed for victory, the tension grew. The railroad would become a symbol of power and innovation, but also of a frenzied race where time and resources were precious commodities. Workers from diverse backgrounds, including Chinese and Irish immigrants, were willing to face what seemed insane to help connect the country. The work was grueling, often deadly, but the promise of a new world beyond the horizon made everything seem justifiable. Everyone knew that once the tracks were connected, everything would change. The railroad was starting to become more than just an idea. It was already a reality taking shape, a true phenomenon about to explode in a wave of changes that no one could foresee. But the impact of all this would go far beyond the mountains or the open land. What no one yet knew was how this change would really affect the lives of those who had already called the Old West home. And as the tracks extended, a new era was about to begin, bringing with it a revolution that would challenge everything the people of the West knew. When the railroad finally arrived, it brought with it a wave of change as powerful as it was unexpected. Towns that had once been isolated, unable to connect with other parts of the country, were now accessible quickly and efficiently. Trade flourished, new industries emerged, and the population of small villages began to grow. The railroad brought, almost magically, the promise of a prosperous future. The iron tracks not only cut through the land of the West, but also broke down the barriers of time and space, bringing with them civilization, progress, and, for many, a new chance at life. For workers who had dedicated their lives to the fields or small towns, the railroad meant new opportunities. Merchants, for example, saw goods arriving and departing at a pace they had never imagined. Instead of waiting weeks or months for a shipment, everything was now possible in just a few days. However, it wasn't just trade that was experiencing this revolution. The arrival of new people, ideas, and habits began to modify daily life. Those villages once isolated became bustling commercial centers, with busy markets, new buildings, and an energy that could no longer be ignored. The railroad also represented a massive shift in the way people lived. Families could now travel more easily, taking with them the possibility of exploring new lands or visiting relatives who had once been unreachable. The tremors of the railroad's impact weren't limited to the economy or trade. They primarily affected social relationships. People who had once lived in complete isolation were now meeting and interacting at a speed previously unimaginable. The distance between people, which had once seemed endless, became a railroad track that could be crossed with ease. But while progress was evident, it also brought unexpected challenges. The explosion of new people, businesses, and markets resulted in overcrowding and competition. The pressure to grow quickly and adapt to the new railroad world led to an increase in social tensions. Some communities thrived while others were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of migrants and speculators. Those who had been accustomed to the calm of the Old West felt as if they were losing their identity, swallowed by the rapid pace of changes brought by the railroad. The arrival of the railroad didn't just connect distant geographies. It also linked cultures, ideas, and ways of life that had previously been completely disconnected. With the advent of the train, people from diverse backgrounds began to mix. in ways that had never happened before in the Old West. Chinese, Irish, African American, and other immigrant workers were brought in to build the railroad. For many, the railroad represented a chance for a new life, but it also brought challenges. The clash between different cultures and social classes brought a new dynamic to the West, resulting in a unique but often conflicted fusion of peoples and traditions. While the railroad opened doors to opportunities, it also sparked a significant cultural shock. For Native Americans, the expansion of railroads meant more than just the loss of land. It represented the destruction of their cultures and traditions. The sound of the train cutting through the horizon was not just a promise of progress, but also a direct threat to their way of life. For many natives, the West was being invaded in a way that could not be stopped. The arrival of the railroad accelerated the presence of settlers, soldiers, and traders, forcing indigenous peoples to move or confront a system they didn't fully understand. On the other hand, for settlers and immigrants, the railroad represented the dream of a brighter future. The cities along the railroads began to thrive with a growing population and a new economy. However, this growth was not always welcome. The old ways of life, with cowboys and cattlemen dominating the scene, began to be challenged by new urban lifestyles, with merchants, politicians, and businessmen taking center stage. The transition from a wilder West to a more modern, commercialized West began to completely transform the social and cultural landscape of the region. Additionally, the arrival of the railroad also accelerated the spread of new ideas and beliefs. The gospel and principles of civilization began to spread more quickly as missionaries and religious leaders saw the railroad expansion as an opportunity to spread their messages. Life in the Old West, once governed by its own code of morality and survival, now found itself invaded by more structured ideologies, often coming from the more established society of the East. The cultural and social impact was as deep as the economic transformation itself, leaving marks that still resonate today. The arrival of the railroad brought with it a revolution in transportation and trade, significantly impacting two of the Old West's main economic activities, cattle ranching and agriculture. Before the railroad, cattle were herded across vast stretches of land, with cowboys managing herds over thousands of miles, often with no easy access to markets or urban centers. Transporting cattle was a monumental task, requiring long journeys to eastern markets where the meat could be sold. This process was not only time-consuming, but also risky, with great losses occurring along the way. When the railroad came into play, everything changed. Cattle transport became more efficient, faster, and more profitable. Cattle could now be shipped in large quantities to eastern markets in record time, opening the doors to a new era of large-scale meat trade. The railroad routes became the main arteries that connected the vast pastures of the West to major urban centers, allowing the cattle market to thrive like never before. Ranches and farms prospered, and the West became a vital hub for the meat industry, generating millions of dollars for landowners and workers in the region. Similarly, agriculture also experienced explosive growth. With the arrival of the railroads, crops that had once been limited to local consumption could now be shipped across the country, opening markets that had never been imagined. The transportation of grains, fruits, and other agricultural products was made easier, allowing Western farmers to expand their operations and reach consumers nationwide. Small towns, once reliant on local markets, now found themselves as major commercial hubs. The railroad not only improved transportation, but also opened new possibilities for irrigation and the use of new farming techniques, which enhanced the productivity of the land. However, this economic revolution brought with it new challenges. The increase in cattle and agricultural production also put pressure on natural resources and native populations. The vast grazing lands began to be divided among new landowners, while agricultural areas expanded, forcing native populations to move further on to remote lands. The rapid pace of growth began to strain the region's ecological balance, and land disputes became more frequent. Progress brought prosperity, but also created new problems for those left behind. The arrival of the railroad in the Old West was not just a technological advancement. It brought with it a series of conflicts and challenges that drastically altered the region's balance. The most significant of these was the direct impact on native populations who saw their lands and way of life threatened by the expansion of the railroads. For indigenous peoples, the railroad represented not just a means of transportation, but a symbol of the invasion of their lands, which they had relied on for generations. The sound of the train cutting through the vast territories they occupied was not just a sign of progress, but a warning that their lands were being taken and their way of life destroyed. The construction of the railroads accelerated the migration of settlers to the west, who in turn began to compete for land with the natives. The federal government, eager to ensure the railroad was built at all costs, often forced indigenous peoples to give up their lands, resulting in violent confrontations. The battles were not just physical, but also cultural and spiritual. For many, the railroads represented the destruction of everything they believed to be sacred, and resistance intensified with attacks on soldiers and settlers. For Native Americans, the arrival of the railroad was not just a change in territory, but a direct attack on their identity. At the same time, settlers who moved to the west were mostly part of a larger national expansion movement. Many saw the railroads as an opportunity to prosper, to finally acquire their own land. However, for these settlers, the expansion to the west meant the end of the Old West, the land of cowboys and freedom without rules. The railroad brought urbanization, market economies, and organization that transformed vast lands into structured and organized spaces, creating a sharp contrast between the nomadic lifestyle of the first settlers and the order imposed by the tracks. Furthermore, the construction of the railroads also generated tensions among the workers themselves. Many of the Chinese immigrants who were responsible for building the railroad faced discrimination and extremely dangerous working conditions. These workers were often at the mercy of their circumstances, and even though they played an essential role in the railroad's construction, they were treated with disdain and hostility by other groups. The scene of conflict was broader, involving disputes over class, ethnicity, and ideology, reflecting the immense human cost that this grand engineering feat demanded. The railroad, in its essence, symbolized progress, a technological advancement that seemed to carry with it the future, transforming the Old West into a more connected, modern, and organized land. With the tracks arriving, isolation was gradually replaced by the promise of a new era, where speed, communication, and trade would be the driving forces of growth. Cities expanded rapidly, businesses thrived, and agriculture and industry flourished like never before. The railroad became the beating heart of the West, linking it to the rest of the country, carrying with it the dreams of a nation under construction. However, like any symbol of progress, the railroad also brought its dangers. Work on the railroads was grueling and often deadly. Men risked their lives to lay the tracks, facing explosions, rockfalls, and the harsh elements. The pressure to complete the railroad quickly led to extreme working conditions. Accidents were common, and many families lost loved ones while the railroad advanced across the land. For the workers, the symbol of progress also represented a sentence of physical exhaustion and even death. While cities modernized and economies grew, there were those whose lives were destroyed on the iron tracks. Nature, too, was not spared from the impacts of the railroad. The vast wilderness, which had once been home to countless species of animals, began to be fragmented, and ecosystems were altered. The displacement of animals, such as bison and deer, became a direct consequence of the railroad construction, which cut through vital areas for the survival of these species. The environmental impact was immense and often ignored in the name of progress. The rapid pace of railroad expansion led to destruction that would forever alter the natural landscape of the West, and the noise and pollution from locomotives came to dominate the region. Finally, the social consequences were undeniable. The railroad not only united the country but also brought a new type of inequality and tension. The rapid growth of railroad towns resulted in unchecked urbanization, often without the infrastructure to handle the growing population. Social inequality intensified, with new groups of workers, merchants, and investors creating an ever-widening gap between social classes. While some prospered with the arrival of the train, many saw their lives ruined by the rapid, relentless changes. The railroad was, then, not only a symbol of progress, but also of contradictions, of growth that led both to prosperity and suffering. The impact of the railroads on the Old West is undeniable and profound. The arrival of the iron tracks brought with it a transformation that went far beyond the simple transportation of goods and people. The railroad changed boundaries, reshaped trade and the economy, and completely remade the social and cultural landscape of the West. It was undoubtedly the dividing line between the old and the new, between the Wild West and the modern era. The isolated towns became prosperous metropolises, and the old paths of nomads were replaced by the trails of locomotives. The West, once a place of adventure, desolation, and opportunities for a few, now became a hub of growth, but also of contradictions. The railroad brought unprecedented prosperity, but also accelerated conflicts. While it fueled the trade of cattle and agricultural products, it also imposed new challenges on native populations, forcing them to relocate and fight against relentless change. The immigrants who helped build the railroads were also left on the margins, facing discrimination and exploitation despite their vital contribution. The West that emerged from the construction of the railroads was not the wild and romantic West of the past, but a more urban, more competitive West where progress brought both opportunities and inequality. But the legacy of the railroad goes beyond the immediate economic and social impact. it was also responsible for a deep change in the way Americans viewed their own country. The West, once seen as a remote and difficult-to-reach place, was now within reach for all. The railroad was a metaphor for the American dream of expansion, of conquering new frontiers and new possibilities, but it also brought to light the human costs of that dream. It physically connected the country, but it also divided it into new lines of class, ethnicity, and power. The Old West, as it was known, was forever transformed. Today, the old railroad routes are remembered with a mixture of nostalgia and reflection. What began as a line of tracks cutting across vast distances is now a symbol of an era that shaped modern America. The Old West, with its promises of freedom and prosperity, was completely remade by that simple yet immense technological advancement. The railroad, while a symbol of conquest and progress, also serves as a reminder that behind every great advancement, there are always stories of struggle, suffering, and transformation. The legacy of the railroad is one of the most powerful and complex chapters in American history, and its lessons continue to echo to this day.